Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. Over the weekend, Syria once again found itself in the headlines, this time after clashes between the new regime led by Ahmed Ashara and the Alawite community, loyalists of the former president and the ousted regime of Bashar al-Assad. While Syria's conflict has evolved over the years from civil war to proxy battleground, the latest round of fighting raises new questions. Where is Syria heading? Is the new regime's grip on power as firm as it seems, or are we witnessing the early signs of an even deeper instability? To help us make sense of it all, I'm joined by Charles Lister, senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and one of the foremost experts on Syria and regional geopolitics. Charles has spent years tracking developments in Syria, from the rise of jihadist factions to shifting international interventions, and his insights when it comes to Syria are second to none. We talk about the significance of the latest clashes and what do they tell us about the new HTS-led regime, how external players from Iran, Russia, Turkey, and the US are responding to what's been happening in Syria, whether the country is heading toward another round of conflict, and of course, what should Israel be doing when it comes to all of this? It's a conversation you won't want to miss. Charles Lister, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, I was thinking we need to have a conversation about Syria, and we here and around the world, I think people need to understand a bit more of what's going on there. But I'll start the conversation, and maybe my first question will be, we all kind of thought that this new government, these rebels who barreled through the country just a few months ago, ousted Bashar al-Assad, the so-called butcher of Damascus. They were on their charm offensive across the West. The foreign minister goes to Davos, sits on stage with Tony Blair, talks about women's rights, we're opening up the country, democracy, and then we see what happens just over the weekend, where hundreds, if not more, of people were massacred, the Alawites, by soldiers and rebels affiliated with the new regime. So create some order in this chaos, if you can. What's going on there?
Well, easier said than done to create order from the chaos, because there is a lot of chaos. There's a huge amount of complexity and a million moving pieces. Let me rewind to sort of very early on in the post-Assad days, when, yes, the sort of interim government made a very swift announcement that the Assad-era army was to be dissolved, that all of its members associated with the military as well as the security services would be basically invited to what was called settle their status. So offices were set up all across the country in which these men could register, bring in their Syrian ID cards. In almost all cases, they were then cleared to either return back to civilian life or to enlist in the new military. And in some cases, people were investigated further when there was significant evidence of them having committed crimes. Now, I raise all of this because all across the country, tens of thousands of men voluntarily went through this process. But what was known, and I was in Damascus about 3 weeks ago, what was known was that around 4,000 to 5,000 men, almost all of them Alawites, in Latakia and Tartus, had not volunteered to go through this process. And from the perspective of the interim government, this was a serious source of concern, but they had made the decision that they weren't going to go after such a large number of men in such a large expanse of territory, because obviously the optics of that would have looked like they were hunting down Alawites and being discriminatory in the way that they were acting. So they made the decision not to do that. I suspect, more or less, that was the right pragmatic decision to make at the time, but there was a cost to that. So over the last 3 to 4 weeks, there were prior to this sudden spike in violence, there were nearly 50 attacks by largely Alawite, pro-regime, loyalist resistance, again, mostly in Latakia and Tartus, against the interim government. And the frequency of those attacks, as well as the deadliness of those attacks, was steadily creeping up to the point at which we saw this enormous explosion of violence starting Thursday night last week. So clearly, some portion of those men have made the decision over the past several months to take up arms or retake up arms against the interim government, which again puts that somewhat pragmatic decision by the interim authorities in some perspective. But what happened on Thursday night was initially a huge wave of attacks by these Alawite gunmen, mostly against interim government targets, about a dozen different checkpoints, the headquarters of the General Security, headquarters of police, headquarters of public security in both Latakia and Tartus, and some internecine warfare in which these Alawite gunmen launched attacks against rival villages on the coast. And there's a reason for that as well. So this is another layer of complexity. So speaking to Alawites in both coastal governorates, it was very clear that everyone knew that something was coming. In fact, most of the villages in the mountains had been prior communicated by these gunmen who had organized, coordinated militias and asked for their support in the coming coup, as they were calling it. Some of those communities abided by those demands and others said no. The ones that said no were attacked, and there were massacres too of both Alawites and Sunnis by these gunmen. Of course, all of this was designed to provoke an even more vicious response. And that response came from, in part, the interim government, in part by small numbers of foreign fighters who traveled to the coast from Idlib, and in part by thousands of men, just ordinary men who are not part of the government at all, who took up arms and traveled from all across the country to exact revenge. And that's where we suddenly found ourselves in this horrible cycle of largely sectarian killings. And then, yes, as you say, hundreds are dead. The most reliable monitor of Syrian civilian casualties over the last 14 years is the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and they've put out an excellent and extraordinarily detailed report of dozens of pages of details in terms of what exactly happened, who was killed. But all in all, about 40% of all of the casualties were caused by the Alawite gunmen and around 60% by everybody else, linked officially or unofficially with the interim government. But anyway, I could talk about this forever. The key thing is to say Syria's been a boiling pot for 3 months. In many ways, it's a miracle that it took this long for us to get to this kind of a point. So in some ways, it was tragically inevitable. It's also encouraging that 5 days later, everything has calmed down. And most of the minority communities have all come out expressing cautious support for the interim government as long as justice and accountability are found.
So a few questions. The first is, I mean, kind of in your depiction of this of the situation, there is an element here of enforcement of rule and law by the new regime, because you have these Alawite loyalists of the former regime of the Assad family, and important to point out that Bashar al-Assad himself descends from an Alawite family, and that those are where his most loyal followers did come from, that group along the coast in those cities that you mentioned, Tartus and Latakia. So there is, I guess, that element of we can't tolerate this type of disruption and insurgency. On the other hand, maybe the response was a little more aggressive than people would have wanted to see. But before we even go there, I'm just curious. The Alawites who are launching these attacks, is it because, in your sense, are they being directed by Assad? Is it an attempt to overthrow the new regime? Is this just a counterinsurgency like we see in other countries? How do you understand that kind of fighting?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think this is the most important question. Exactly, what do these guys want, and to what extent are they linked with any external influence? So I think, honestly, the situation is still very murky. I know for a fact that on Thursday night, when all of this kicked off, the General Security Service, which is basically like the military wing of the Interior Ministry in Damascus, and probably the most elite, most kind of intelligence coordinated security body in the country, they launched a targeted raid on a farm compound outside Jableh on the coast in Latakia, on intelligence provided to them by Alawites. That this was kind of the command headquarters for this new resistance, and when they launched that raid, they discovered almost brand new satellite maps showing the winter terrain. So clearly something new. Somebody had provided them with satellite maps of the terrain of interim government positions, big, large maps spread out across the walls and tables for planning, large quantities of US dollar cash, which was presumably being used to pay people off or pay salaries. as well as obviously large amounts of weapons and sophisticated communications equipment, which at the very minimum was in the midst of, airing communications elsewhere in Syria, as far as Raqqa, to the other side of the country. And there was quite some suspicion that it may have been used in the past for communications outside of Syria.
And who do we
The
know where
interim
this stuff came from? Do you think it's Iranian? What would
So
your
that was literally my next sentence, which is
Mhm.
that I think the interim government believes, but it's so far not publishing the evidence for this. But from my communications with Damascus, they believe that yes, this is Iranian linked. There's significant cause for directing that concern, which is that every single leader of this Alawite resistance that has publicly associated themselves in a leadership position are remnants of the 4th Division, which of course used to be run by Maher al-Assad, Bashar's brother. Maher was Iran's man in Syria. The 4th Division was Iran's primary Syrian arm of military influence in Syria. And so right from the very top, we've got around half a dozen former leaders from the 4th Division running this insurgency. So clearly not going to be a Russian operation for all manner of obvious reasons. And if there was external support, it would certainly be coming from Iran. Maher al-Assad was known to have fled directly to Iranian assistance when he left Syria, first to northern Iraq, potentially for a period of time in Iran, and then back to northern Iraq again. So again, we don't have absolutely rock solid evidence for this yet, but everything that we do know is pointing in the direction of Iran having a hand in this. And clearly with the aim of re-establishing a foothold in Syria. They were never going to re-establish a foothold in Syria by stabilizing the country. The best path for coming back was to destabilize Syria. And that clearly was the intention of these initial attacks on Thursday night.
By the way, referring to Maher, Bashar's brother, there was a reported attack at the end of September. I don't think that Israel ever confirmed, but that it was behind it. But there was a bombing of a
Mhm.
villa somewhere in Syria that was believed to have been owned by him. But as you mentioned, he likely has fled the country and he's not there. So he
Right.
wasn't caught up in that strike. The new regime, and I want to talk about them for a moment. Their position on Iran, because we do know that Syria
Mhm.
under Bashar was a close ally of the Iranians, was the conduit for weapons transfers from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. We remember about Syria's own pursuit of nuclear weapons back in 2007 when Israel destroyed their nuclear reactor. So long-term ally, assistance, and supporter of the Islamic Republic in Iran. What is the regime? What is al-Julani, Ashara, the new president? What's his position on the relationship that he should be having with the Iranians?
So it's an interesting question with hopefully an interesting answer, which is that really Russia and Iran were the two key backers of the Assad regime, external backers. When it has come to Russia, the interim government has taken a very, very pragmatic and flexible response, which actually is appearing to be developing diplomatic ties with the Russians. They're wanting to balance. The interim government had from day one a public position of wanting no problems with anyone so as to prioritize the stability and the recovery of Syria. So on the surface, the position on Iran is we don't want problems with Iran. In theory, our doors are open to communication. Now, under the surface, it's much less open and somewhat less pragmatic. Again, they don't want problems with the Iranians, but they're much less open to the idea of, refostering healthy ties with Iran than they are with Russia. I think they recognize Russia is also willing to be more pragmatic, and it's also obviously a significant player on
Russia's
the
interest here is less ideological, right? It's more about
right.
they want to be able to maintain their military presence, which, if correct me if I'm wrong, is on the coast in those military bases, particularly in Tartus, right, or
Yes.
Latakia as well. So that's what Russia's interest. It's not an ideological interest, and therefore maybe they're easier to work with. But the Iranians would be something else.
Yes, exactly. And I think, to be blunt, the for now, and this is likely to change in the next week or two, somewhat. But for now, the interim government is still dominated by Hayat Tahrir Sham or HTS, and yes, they view Iran through an ideological lens of animosity, whereas they view Russia through a more kind of geopolitical political lens. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. In both directions there is much more ideological animosity with Iran than there is with anyone else. So I don't expect there to be, visits by Iranian diplomats to Damascus anytime soon, whereas we have had Russian diplomatic visits to Damascus. And I think over and above anything else, what Syrians are most worried about is instability. And of all of the players out there that they fear the most, in terms of provoking internal instability, it's Iran. I should say significant concerns about Israel's recent actions too, but their biggest concerns are Iran, and they want to avoid provoking any further Iranian actions. And so, in that sense, that's why they maintain that public line of "we don't want problems," but they haven't gone out of their way to establish communication with them either.
So I'm going to get to Israel in a moment because I want to definitely understand how you view the position. I mean, Israel's been bombing targets in Syria. It's been aligning itself with the Druze in Syria. So some interest, it still is holding on to the territory in what they call the buffer
Mhm.
zone along the border. So we'll get to that in a moment, but just still focus for one more minute on the new regime in Ashara himself. This was a guy who HTS, a former affiliate of Al Qaeda, the Jabhat al Nusra, now he's wearing a suit. He looks better, right? Nicely tailored. So he's got some good people working for him. But
Mhm.
if I was the U.S. State Department, I called you and I said, Charles, what should we do? Should we reopen the embassy? Should we send, envoys? Should we provide funding, assistance? What? How do you view these guys?
Um, I think, again, having worked on Syria for 15 years, first of all, we need to temper our expectations. No matter who was running an interim government post Assad in Damascus, they'd be doing an imperfect job. Whether they were overtly secular, whether they were overtly religious, or anything else, they would be doing an imperfect job. Syrians have spent nearly 54 years being trained not to engage in politics. So the mere idea of trying to run a country after all of that and reunite a country divided by more than a decade of war is extraordinarily challenging. So, first of all, I would say we need to temper our expectations. A transition is going to move slowly and imperfectly. Syria will remain unstable for a long time to come. The wounds of not just the past 14 years of war, but also all the way going back to the 1980s with the Hama uprising and the massacres in Hama. All of those wounds still remain very much open. So we're going to have instability for a long time. So key message is temper your expectations. Um, the big strategic goal for, I think, the international community should just simply be the stabilization of Syria. I mean, you and many of your listeners will know that Syria for decades has been like an open wound in the heart of the Middle East, constantly exporting instability, weapons proliferation, and of course, on the Iranian angle, it has been the jewel in the crown of Iran's regional agenda. Nothing would have been accomplished in Palestine, in Lebanon, and anywhere else had it not been for the Assad regime and its willingness to support Iran's regional agenda.
For
So
sure.
the core priority right now should be just stabilizing Syria and also listening to Syrians. And, I spent a considerable amount of time in the country not too long ago, in all corners of the country, speaking to Alawites, Christians, Druze, Ismailis, Sunnis, in all different regions of the country that had experienced the war from many different perspectives. Every single Syrian said, we just want peace. We just want to rebuild and recover and enjoy the fact that we can now live free of the brutal dictatorship that we had known for so long. And that should be all of our respective priorities. Yes, we should unquestionably view HTS with some skepticism. But it has to be said, and again, as someone who's worked on Syria for 15 years, if someone had said to me 6 months ago that Bashar al Assad would fall in the space of 10 days and the interim government would be run by HTS, the picture I would have painted of the Syria that would result from that would have been really an ugly, ugly picture. Very little of that has actually come to fruition. And in again, from Syrian perspective, speaking to all the minorities, they are happy today, far happier than they were under the regime. Of course, they have concerns about what the future holds, the prospects for recovering and rebuilding, some concerns about whether or not Ahmed al-Shara will fully loosen his grip over the reins of power over time, but ultimately they are just happy to be free and to have a light at the end of the tunnel. So again, just to reiterate, temper expectations, be patient, yes, have conditions, yes, be skeptical, but if we want to be able to control where this transitional government goes, engaging it gives us a far greater amount of leverage than isolating it. If we isolate it, we guarantee that things will eventually fall apart. And then, like we talked about 5, 10 minutes ago, we know exactly who will fill that vacuum. The
Right.
Iranians are just waiting to come back in, as are ISIS and as are others. You know, all the bad guys we don't want to hold power, the really, really bad guys we don't want to be holding power, are just waiting for that chance. And so stability has to be our utmost priority.
So explain to me also, if you can, and then we'll get to Israel, Turkey's role in all of this. So Erdogan, to a large extent, correct me if I'm wrong, was the main financier, supporter, backer of HTS when they originally set out to overthrow Assad. Now Turkey, to a large extent, is somehow divided. You still have an American presence, you have a Russian presence, you have now the new Syrian regime presence, which you could say is a Turkish presence, you have the Israeli presence. What does Erdogan want here? And I'll just add to that also this other element that originally there was a lot of concern that he would send HTS or the new government, the rebels, to go up against the Kurds to the
Mm.
northeast. So far, that hasn't really happened. And instead, they're signing deals, and it seems like they're trying to get along with the new regime. You mentioned ISIS, for example. The Kurds had been in control of prisons there, where there's like, I don't know,
Right.
9,000 ISIS guys. Those are also going to come under control of the new regime, as well as border crossings, etc. So, what's Turkey's interest here?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. It's also one that's like full of nuance and the grey rather than the black and the white. So, I mean, for years, since late 2016, Turkey's position on Syria began to shift away from the idea that they wanted to concentrate all their energy on overthrowing Assad, and more to the idea that they wanted to counter terrorism, and in their eyes, that was predominantly the PKK, but then also ISIS. And secondarily, and perhaps even more importantly, they just wanted stability along their border with Syria. Stability in the sense that they didn't want more refugees crossing into Turkey, and ideally they wanted refugees in Turkey to return to Syria. So counterterrorism and stability was Turkey's primary concern since basically late 2016, early 2017. And as a result of that, they began basically propping up different entities in the northwest of the country to do that job, to stabilize, to hold the border, and to hold a line against the regime. They didn't want them fighting the regime so much as just holding the line. Um, and some of those entities were what's called the Syrian National Army. And I should say the SNA is a deeply problematic umbrella of militia and militia groups and warlords. And if anything, the SNA poses much more of a lawless and to an extent sectarian problem than actually the HTS interim government does. But that's a whole nother conversation. And then they also helped prop up HTS. Now, again, having just recently traveled all across Syria, it was quite remarkable, I have to say, that service provision and stability in HTS areas was by a country mile better than anywhere else in Syria. Idlib has had 24/7 electricity for the last 5 years. In regime-held areas, you got about an hour a day. And a lot of that was because the Turkish state invested their own infrastructure. So they basically just extended electricity and water provision into this northwestern area of Syria, primarily because they wanted stability. They didn't want people revolting against HTS, and they wanted, sorry, refugees in Turkey to return to Idlib. But the nature of the relationship with HTS specifically was extremely complicated. So still to this day, HTS is a designated terrorist organization by Turkish law. So none of the relationship was run through their sort of State Department, through their foreign ministry. It was all the military. It was run through the intelligence service. And so obviously that makes the nature of a relationship much more complicated. It wasn't diplomatic, it wasn't official, it was unofficial. And it was awkward. There were many flare-ups between Turkey and HTS. But unquestionably, Turkey saw HTS as an asset because it was able to exert control and it was able to exert stability. Now, when HTS launched this offensive on November the 27th last year, they launched that offensive against the wishes of Turkey. In fact, the offensive was actually meant to start 6 weeks earlier, and when the Turks found out, they put a stop to it. Not only did they put a stop to it, they then fed intelligence to the Russians, who then launched a massive air campaign in Idlib against all of the frontline positions that would have launched that offensive. So the key thing here to say is actually, initially, Turkey didn't want this offensive to happen at all. And incidentally, the offensive wasn't planned to take over Damascus. It was just aimed to take the western countryside around Aleppo city, where the regime was shelling civilian communities. Anyway, the offensive happened. It took the fall of Aleppo city, the surprise fall of the city, to change Turkey's calculations. And suddenly, I think they realized that the regime was falling like a house of cards, and they had a real opportunity to change the equation. So at that point, the Turks did step in and started providing intelligence and various other support to facilitate this very rapid offensive. Cut a very long story short, we now have the interim government. Everyone, as your question implies, would have expected that the Turks would basically be running the game in Damascus. Perhaps surprisingly, Ahmed al-Shara specifically made the decision on day one that he didn't want to be seen as anyone's puppet. Mm-hmm. And so he's actually invested, along with his foreign minister, much more in a relationship with the Saudis than he has with the Turks. And he's seeking to balance. So he still obviously has the relationship with Turkey, but he wants to balance that. He doesn't want to be controlled by any one particular actor. And he certainly doesn't want to be presented negatively by in a way that he is the Turkish puppet or the Saudi puppet or anybody else's. So he's balancing those relationships. And so, yes, Turkey has lots of grand plans.
The Saudi relationship is for the money, obviously, which he needs for the reconstruction.
The money and the regional clout. I mean, when the Saudis made the decision, and, to be, very open with you, I was invited to Saudi Arabia shortly after Assad fell, because at that point they did not know what they should do. They needed advice, they needed information about who these guys were, what they wanted, how they were likely to act. They didn't really know whether they should side with the interim government and engage or choose the opposite approach. They made the decision to go whole hog, full engagement mode, because they see this as a historic opportunity to reshape the heart of the Middle East and to deal Iran a permanent blow in the region. But so yes, there's money involved, but it's actually because what the Saudis do, everyone else will do in the region. So if the Saudis engage, everyone else engage, including the Emiratis, who, you would have thought ideologically would have had serious, serious problems with the idea of an HTS interim government. Even the Emiratis engaged. Going back to the recent horrific violence on the coast, the entire regional kind of coalition came out immediately in public support of the interim government, including the UAE, including Egypt. They all came out within almost hours and said, the Alawite gunmen are to blame, the interim government deserves our regional support. So again, that kind of historic opportunity mindset is something that has, for now at least, united the whole region behind the idea that despite the fact that we'd prefer some other entity than HTS being in charge right now, this is a huge opportunity that shouldn't be missed.
So Charles, now Israel. Okay, and I'm sure you saw how we're talking on Wednesday, how on Tuesday, Defense Minister Israel Katz, no relation, by the way, flew to the top of the Hermon mountain on the Syrian side and basically said, hey, Shara, Syria's new leader, we're not going anywhere. We're here indefinitely. So how do the Syrians look at this Israeli presence? And then there's the whole element with the Druze, where Israel has said if
Mhm.
the new regime attacks Druze communities, a minority in Syria, we will come to their defense. They're allowing Druze into Israel. They announced that also to begin working on the Israeli side of the Golan Heights. How do you view? Let me ask you two questions, actually. How does Syria view what Israel's doing? And how do you view what Israel's doing?
I don't know which one to start with. I mean, let me say, maybe I'll start with me and then I'll go to Syria. I mean, I totally understand, especially given what's happened over the last 18 months, why Israel's posture will be about maximally protecting security, learning the lessons of the past. Buffer zones on all sides of the border seem to be, the chosen policy. And so, in a sort of psychological perspective, I totally get it. I also understand that in a time of such dynamic change, the idea that an unknown and potentially hostile new interim government in control of air defense systems and aircraft and things would be deemed unacceptable. So I also psychologically understand that. Um, I guess my main concern is the longer term strategic question, which is, what we've talked about already. The outgoing Biden administration, the Europeans, the regional states, the UN, INGOs, the international legal community have all made this calculation that the primary priority in Syria has to be stability. And that if we're going to try to shape the behavior of the interim government, then engaging it is a far better strategy than isolating, let alone provoking it. And so I do have concerns that, to be blunt, most of Israel's behavior has been provocative. It's not been calming or stabilizing. It's been provocative. Um, and that there is a concern that at some point that will risk serious destabilization in Syria. And in theory, that should not be in Israel's interest. Israel wants stability on all of its borders. Um, if we are to believe the words of the interim government that they want problems with nobody, that includes Israel. I think the fact that in the first, so far, roughly 3 months of the transition, the interim government has intercepted 16 weapons shipments heading towards Lebanon. Not only have they intercepted them, they have made a big song and dance online about these interceptions. They are clearly trying to send a message to Israel that we are willing to do what Assad was unwilling to do, which is to stop weapons going from Syria to Hezbollah. Hezbollah is our shared enemy. This is sort of Syrian words, not just mine. They are clearly trying to send that message. Let's also not forget that Ahmad al-Shara for years went by the name Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. That's, he traces his origins back to the Golan Heights. He made the obvious decision to take on his real name when he walked into Damascus, but that origin story in the Golan Heights would, in theory, mean that the expanded buffer zone and occupation of Syrian territory would be a real trigger for him. But it hasn't triggered anything. He hasn't even voiced hostility to Israel. In fact, he has stopped calling Israel the Zionist project and all of these various terms, and he's calling it the State of Israel, which, historically from a Syrian perspective is a pretty big deal. Certainly a huge deal for an organization that traces its origins originally to Al Qaeda. So in theory, all of these early steps should be seen as encouraging, but at the moment we still have this kind of provoking policy from Israel, and I worry that risks scuppering what honestly does look like mostly good faith from Damascus until now. And on the Druze issue, again, one of my most palpable takeaways from my trip all across Syria was that Syrians want to reunify the country. That is their desperate wish. They want to reunify the country, and the Druze included. And when I went to Sweden, I spent time there. I met with Sheikh al-Hijri and all of the Druze militias. All they want is to reunify the country. Yes, of course, they have their own, localized demands around governance and local stability and who commands the police. But all of that right now, even as of just while we're recording this, is just being sealed in a memorandum of understanding between the Druze leadership and Damascus. And so within that environment, again, where from a Syrian perspective, and I'm coming here into the Syrian perspective more, from the Syrian perspective, all of these issues are slowly being worked out. Really thorny, difficult, complicated issues with the SDF in the northeast, with the Druze in the south. But they are being worked out. Differences are being bridged. Compromises are being made. And then, again, from a Syrian perspective, you then have Israel putting out all these public statements saying, we're siding with the Druze, that, if the Druze get attacked, we're going to protect them, we're going to intervene. It doesn't sort of help that equation on the ground of trying to bridge all of
But
these
do you
gaps.
see? I mean, if I understand what you're saying, I would say, okay, Israel, listen, let's wait and see what happens. Makes sense to
Hmm.
hold on to the buffer for now until we know who these guys are and what their true intentions are. And especially in light of lessons learned from October 7, Israel
Right.
can't gamble anymore. And you did say that. But if things work out okay, you could start to retreat and move back. Do you think that the thing with the Druze leads to a potential other agenda by Israel here that might be purposely or intentionally trying to undermine the new regime? I'm curious kind of how you see that.
Yeah, well, to be blunt, I know for a fact that an Israeli delegation was in Washington around 10 days ago with a white paper that basically pointed in exactly that direction, which is not just to isolate the interim government in Damascus, but to eventually provoke its downfall. Honestly, I think that's just wildly the wrong decision to be making, given how fragile, how potentially unstable Syria can be. That's like a worst case. That should be a worst case scenario for Israel, not the ideal objective or goal on the table. And yeah, I think the Druze dynamic is complicated. So to give you another example, a couple of weeks ago or so, there was some fighting in Jaramana, which is a district just south of the capital, Damascus. Basically, it's a suburb of the capital, and Jaramana is a majority Druze area. Um, the conflict began when a small group of Druze gunmen killed an interim government soldier who was trying to get into Jaramana to visit his relatives. And that then triggered a big standoff in which the interim government said that these men needed to be arrested and prosecuted for murder. And then there was like 24 hours of on and off kind of clashes and a standoff. In the mix of that, the Druze community from Sweda in the south sent up all of their militia leaders to Damascus to negotiate a kind of sort of surrender compromise deal in which those men would be turned over to the judiciary and the normality in which the interim government was providing local security would return. Now, at that point, at that night, the Israeli Minister of Defense issued a public statement saying that there had been some kind of plan put on the table to launch a military intervention to protect the Druze in Jaramana. Now, for all of your listeners should understand that the gunmen and the small militia responsible for that initial act are almost entirely Assad loyalists. They were basically the Shabiha in Jaramana. Jaramana was notorious for being run by a Druze militia very much loyal to Syria's military intelligence directorate that dealt in the Captagon trade. These were the guys that triggered that. So when Israel publicly comes out in potential support, they're basically, from a Syrian perspective, coming out in support of the regime, of Assad's regime. So there's that, and then in Sweden right now, all of the core Druze militias have come out publicly and said they oppose, in their words, they're putting it diplomatically, they oppose external interference. What they mean is they don't want Israel interfering. The smallest Druze militia is called the Sweden Military Council, and it was only established in December. And there are quite widespread beliefs that there are links between Israel and this Sweden Military Council. Now, half of the leadership of the Sweden Military Council are former Assad regime generals. And so, again, from a Syrian perspective, they look at this one small militia in the south that is publicly calling for Israeli protection, and half of its leaders are former generals in the Syrian regime intelligence. So, big problem from an optics perspective when then Israel comes out and says they want to protect these guys. If Israel's overarching concern is security, Israel should not want to be seen as basically de facto backing a return of Assad's regime when 98% of Syrians want absolutely nothing to do with that prospect and frankly are wholeheartedly hostile to it. So again, from an Israeli strategic perspective, that doesn't make to me a lot of strategic sense. What does make strategic sense is, as you describe it, which is just sort of back off a little bit, give it time to see where all of this goes. If it goes sour, you're primed and you're positioned to respond however you need to. But if it stabilizes and Syria starts moving forward, you can then sort of, back off and be content, albeit with a watchful eye,
Right.
at what happens.
And you know who's going to make the decisions on all of this at the end of the day? Donald J. Trump is going to,
Yeah, I have a feeling.
At least from the Israeli perspective, I think that if he
Hmm.
decides at some point, and we can't necessarily predict, but if he does decide, no, we want to embrace these guys, we want to help these guys, the new government in Syria, and he says to Netanyahu, listen, get your guys out of there. It's time to empower the new regime. And you need to withdraw so that he can exert sovereignty and look strong, then we're going to see, I think, a different Israeli strategy. So the Israeli strategy as of now, we can at least assume it's in coordination with the U.S. administration for the time being. Charles, thank you so much for being with us on this episode, and really very enlightening for anyone, for a really dynamic and complex evolving situation in Syria. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode. As always, you can find us where podcasts can be found on Apple and Spotify, YouTube, and of course, the website of Times of Israel. We'll be back next Monday with another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast. In the meantime, hoping